Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. We've got people logging in, got some Queenslanders coming in there now, some people from Northern Victoria. Everyone's just logging in now and having a cup of tea. So welcome to our conversation here this morning with Scott McDonald and Jade Climo. Welcome, still coming in there, guys. Take a seat, grab a cup of tea, get yourself sorted. My name's Mike Ryan. I work for Eagle Direct. I guess part of the joys of our job is seeing progressions in our industry and seeing how our industry is changing. We're going to start the conversation today just in regards to approval, as we see animals sort of moving into housed environments. We need approval from our local council and our local government, our neighbours, our customers and people we're selling our product to. And also, strangely enough, the media, and it's the perceptions that are out there that are so far away from reality. And I guess I've been blessed this week, being able to travel again and seeing some of these projects that people have answered these questions, like Jade and Scott, who are on today. And they've answered these questions before they've gone into the process of actually building something and putting something down. Because concrete's awfully dear and sheds are awfully dear, and we want to make sure we've got everything planned out. So I guess going through these facilities the last few days, we've seen all those environmental issues ticked before anything happens. It's also the animal health issues that have been ticked and that animal welfare, and also looking after staff. So staff are in a good environment, and they're creating great environments for staff to be able to work in. So I'm going to throw it over to Scott McDonald. We're blessed to have Scott here today. Scott's knows a lot of the projects that are happening and been involved in this, I guess, in this line of work for the last 21 years. The one thing that's great about Scott is he's for the farmer, he's for our industry and seeing our industry move forward in this way. And we've also got Jade Climo, who's going to be there to answer any questions as we go through. We've just lost Scott. So Jade's going to answer any questions. Jade's just, you might have seen on LinkedIn or Facebook there, Jade and I were in front of his 1,000 cow freestall barn yesterday, and he had a big grin on his face after 12 months of being in there. So it's really rewarding to see those processes. So we literally have just lost Scott off the line there. I was just about to throw it over to him. The joys of live television. We'll get on to him here shortly.
Don't throw me in the deep end here.
No, that's right. You've got your slides sorted, haven't you? Dean might be able to get hold of him there now. So I would, another thing, we're going to have a question and answer after the presentation. So if you've got anything, there's a chat box down the bottom, throw those question and answers in there, and Jade and Scott can answer those and start that conversation after we finish. Got a few South Australians on. Hello, South Australia. I guess, Jade, while we're waiting for Scott to come online there, you've had a few visitors come through your facility.
Yep.
And I guess what's the question that you get asked the most from people coming through?
The most. There's always a lot about bedding. I reckon bedding seems to be a decision the farmers get to, and like it's a hard decision, and not all the industry is doing the same thing. So that's a pretty common one. We're on sand, and a lot of them want to know why and how did we come to that decision. So yeah, that's a common one. Common one is also, what would you do different? That old classic. So yeah, but there's always a few different questions. Yeah.
And you've had staff go through the progression. One thing you talk about often when we put you in front of a camera is staff and and those jobs that you've got, how have your staff adapted to it? Have you got to have big changeover of staff, or
Yeah.
how does that work?
Well, staff, it's not the barn's fault, but it's been a troublesome year from a staff front, nothing to do with the barn. The barn only makes it easier for staff. They can get in a rhythm, they can find their groove, and the next week, instead of it changing, it's the same again. And in 6 months' time, it's still the same. So they can get really used to it. It gets very repetitious. And I don't get a lot of questions related to the barn anymore. It's from a staff point of view, plain sailing, I suppose.
And when did you see, I guess you've been in 12 months now, when did you see the biggest improvement in production or cow health? Was that an immediate thing you saw?
No, it's been a remarkable linear production improvement. It's just a little bit every week, every month. It just keeps ticking away. It'll stop at some stage, but or slow. It's probably slowed now, but it's a real, I think as cows carve into it and create their lactation curve, and you keep carving into it, it just keeps building. That's been a good facet of it, is it just keeps, for the first year, it's kept rising.
Terrific. I think Scott's coming. Oh. He was back online and he's just dropped off again now. Sorry, everybody. And when you've done a progressive approach, Jade, so you've got ideas for other barns to go in around your facility. Is there anything that's going to change in that as you build? Like, you're going to be milking twice as many cows in a barn anyway.
So we're pretty close to making a decision on the second barn pretty soon. So we've only been in a year, so that probably says a lot about what we think of the barn. But I don't think I'll change a lot on the second barn, Mike. No, which probably highlights the fact that your first few decisions are pretty important, and take your time and give yourself. I feel like time is inevitable. To give yourself time is you can't argue against, like gravity. You can't argue about giving yourself time. It's just part of the whole thing. Is for me, to try and concertina that planning up into a shorter point of time would have resulted in a not as good a quality product in the end. Something would have got missed. Something wouldn't have got the thought put in that it deserved.
It's almost like hurry up and wait.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. You can't. It's just nature.
And Jade was quoted the other day to saying he loves his wife. He's got 3 loves: his wife, his kids, and his new freestall barn. I think it's classic. I wasn't going to bring that up, but we had.
No, I'm sure. We're 3 minutes in and it's in.
Now Scott's back online there now. Scott, can we hear you?
Can you hear me, Mike?
We can hear you loud and clear, Scott.
You can see my presentation?
We can see your presentation. What I'll do is I'll throw it over to you, and you can work through it with Jade, and I'll stay on mute here for a while.
No worries.
And just, if you've got any questions as Scott goes through his presentation, fire them into the question and answer at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them afterwards. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Jade.
Thanks, Mike. No, I'll leave my camera off because the internet here is extremely unstable, so I might hopefully get through it. So thanks for jumping today. So I listened to Jake Martin's webinar with Dean Vidicombe a couple of weeks ago, and that was fantastic, just to sort of get the insights of some of those early upfront decisions. So this is sort of the next step. So once you've made that decision, we're going to put some sort of shed up. Where do you go from here? So this is where Agriculture Victoria and some of the other consultants sort of specialise. So I'm going to talk to you about shelters and barns using grazing systems. So this is where we sort of, as industries, we just throw out the common term I'm building a barn. So hopefully after today, you sort of realise that when you put an application in, don't use that term barn loosely, because that could direct which way you go to the planning scheme. So a bit like the sheds and shed builders will tell you, a shed's not a shed. They come in all shapes and sizes. There's different configurations, internal and out. So from a grazing perspective, you've got to understand what's the purpose of these sheds. Are they just shelter? Are they shade? Are we feeding in them? Is there loafing? Is there water? Where are we going to put them on farm? So you need to understand from your perspective, what's the true purpose of putting this shed up? So from a grazing production, that is quite different to an intensive production. So the sheds have different purposes. So under grazing animal production, sheds are going up all around Australia to mitigate climatic events. That's the hot summers, the wet winters when we can't move our herds. So the sheds are going up as sort of a short-term solution until we get out and do some grazing. So it's part of the grazing production system. We know these sheds have infrequent occupations. The cattle will come and go throughout the season, depending on the circumstances. But the message for planning that these facilities are put in place to support grazing. So when grazing is problematic, we can swing the herd, whether they're beef or whether they're dairy, into these sheds to mitigate some sort of circumstances. So as I said, shelter and shade, typically only, or supplementary feeding. So the Victorian planning scheme, I'm going to jump between states because to cover every state sort of planning scheme would take a 5-day presentation. But these are sort of generic enough that they represent all the other states. So even though this says Victoria, this is reflective across the other states. So from a dairy perspective, each state recognises grazing animal production. So that's basically saying if your intention is to put cows out in those paddock, and they often use meaningfully graze. So if the cows are accessing grass, fodder, crops out in the paddock, there's going to be times throughout the year when that's going to be problematic. There will be emergency events go through. So there may be storms, there may be flood, there may be an anthrax where you sort of got to move cows around to consolidate areas, or there may be seasonal variations. There might be a hot summer, the pastures are not growing. So this sort of part of the planning scheme sort of recognises that if you're a grazing animal production farm, you have the right to build these facilities where you can be a bit more flexible in your herd management. So you can put these cows in the shed for 2-3 months of the year while that event's passing through, and as soon as everything rights itself, you're back out in the paddock. So in most states, there's a lot clearer pathway for planning to build these things. A local government will look at these sheds, and we've been on farm with local government, they say that's intensive farming. We say, no, it's not intensive farming. It might be intensive feeding, but the farm is not intensifying its production. So there's quite a difference between intensive farm and intensive feeding. And we'll sort of, that'll unfold as we go through the presentation. So like all planning, there's always strings attached. So basically saying if you're building a concrete feed pad, it's pretty much a rite of passage, but there are some other triggers that will basically bring in some permits. For example, if you're going to put a roof onto it, obviously it's going to trigger buildings and works. You've got footings and foundations going in, you've got to do that to Australian engineering standards. If you can't meet some of the separation distances from neighbours or waterways, or if you're on a property overlay, that's going to basically say, well, you still got a clear pathway for planning, but you might trigger a permit. So let's ask a few more questions. But generally, grazing animal production is a lot simpler planning process as opposed to intensive. So once you go into intensive in Australia, this is from a dairy perspective, we will tell you there are 3 systems. So free stalls is a system in itself. So open or closed individual stalls, a bit like Jade just talked about. Or there's the barns. We sort of generally categorise them as loose housing or composted bedding packs. And the third one's dry lot. And we'll go through why we separate free stalls from barns. So US and other states will talk about free stall barns. From an Australian planning perspective, we separate those terms, and we'll sort of cover that once we get into the effluent manure stuff. So once you sort of cross into intensive dairy systems, these facilities are designed to house cattle for the rest of their lives. They are long-term occupation, and there's a high likelihood that grazing is not going to be part of your farming system. You can't build these systems and sort of graze at the same time because you sort of compromise production. So the Victorian planning scheme says intensive production is land use production where food is imported from outside the building. Same as the cattle feedlot industry, feed is brought into the mobs. That's intensive. You see the New South Wales version for dairy. It's basically saying the same thing, but that actually gives you a time. It says if you've got these facilities outside your dairy, where cows are spending a lot of time in hence these sheds, if cows are spending less than 10 hours a day out in the paddock, well, then you're not grazing, you're intensive. Therefore, you have changed your land use. Therefore, you need to get a permit because you're no longer grazing. So intensification, we know the trends coming through Australia fairly rapidly in the last few years. So the top ones, we all seen these ones, these are the barns. So different manure perspectives. So it's 2 manure streams compared to the free stalls, which is everything's going into the same stream at the back end. So the loafing as opposed to the stalls. So these are 2 intensive systems. So if you put the word intensive free stall or barn in an application, you will cross over permits Australia-wide. Dry lots, we all familiar with, so come out of California, obviously, very prominent in Queensland, New South Wales, Southern Riverina area and Northern Victoria. So this is a part of an intensive farm system that's entered Australia probably 10 years ago, and it's getting a bit more attention, but it's a different form. Just some of the trends. So these are Agriculture Victoria's clients. So we can talk about the clients we are seeing. So these are clients who are going into housing to stop grazing. So these are not the trends of my clients that are going into roof feed pads. That's another set of data. So these are the farmers that we've dealt with through Agriculture Victoria who are saying we are going to stop grazing. Our cows are going to live in one of those 3 facilities, the free stalls, the barns, or the dry lots. You can see from about 2015, the world started to change. The dairy industry, who is a grazing industry and will always be a grazing industry, but there's a small part of that sector saying we can't graze given our circumstances where we live. So we're moving into a housing type system. And the farmers that are coming to us, they're giving us 20 reasons why they need to stop grazing and they need to go into it. So it's more than just climate, it's more than feed waste, it's high production cows, it's labour, it's efficiencies in feeding. There's a whole lot of reasons that basically stack up to say we're probably better off in some sort of house system. The bottom graph, you can see where all the trends are in the farms that we deal with. So obviously, even though Agriculture Victoria, we do have a national role under the Research Development and Extension Framework. So we can provide advice to other farms around Australia in relation to intensive sheds. So you can see Queensland at the moment, from a dairy perspective, there's a big, strong trend towards dry lots. I think over the next few years, Queensland dairy farmers will start to push into the barns. Those that have tried the dry lots will start to put the housing up. You can see New South Wales, massive trend towards the barns, as in Northern Victoria. So you can see up in the pie graph up top, it's basically telling us that those 110 dairy clients I've worked with over all these years, 57% are saying we want to use the barn system. Not to say they can't ever convert that to a free stall, but they're at that stage, we're putting cattle into a barn system, as opposed to 24% are saying, let's go into a free stall. So we know the trend is going to keep coming. There is a lot of demand across the private sector and through Agriculture Victoria. So we know there is a swing towards putting cattle in the housing, which is why we're spending a lot more time. This sort of shows a bit of the breakdown for free stalls. So we keep track of where they are, where farmers are, whether they're early thinking stage, whether they've started the site planning, whether they've submitted applications in the councils, whether they're under constructions. This is important information for us because if there's hold-ups in planning or it's taking longer than we think it should, that gives us a chance to intervene or try to find out what's going wrong. Why is this taking longer to build this system compared to sort of normal? So same for barns and free stalls. And we sort of know the herd capacities, the larger herds will tend to go into the free stalls. So typically of the clients I work with, 41% will put somewhere between 2,000 to 4,000 cows into that facility, a free stall facility, whereas the second most popular one, obviously over 1,000 cows. From a barn perspective, the most common ones that seems to be around the 500 cows to 800 going into the barn system. So we keep records of these trends because it helps us work with the industries to figure out what information farmers need to actually move into these sort of system. So intensive dairy farm, as I said, is it's a section 2. Section 2 is you need a planning permit. This is consistent across all the other states. Other states will call it differently. Victoria calls it intensive dairy farm. South Australia calls it intensive animal husbandry. New South Wales calls it intensive, Queensland the same. So the word might be slightly different from a planning perspective, but basically it's saying you need a permit because you're changing land use. You're no longer grazing. It also puts you in another category, which is a section 3, which basically says this type of farming is not prohibited in certain areas. So obviously the classic one is the rural living. They don't want you to put intensive dairy or intensive beef feedlot next to rural living because there's going to be a lot of objections and planning is going to be impossible to the point that they're not going to let you do it. So from this perspective, once you start getting into intensives, this is where your state guidelines, whether they're beef or dairy, you need to start looking at both the state and national guidelines. That's absolutely critical when you're going from a grazing to an intensive. So in Victoria, there's new codes are coming out next year. So the Victorian Animal Production Codes for intensive industry. So there's one for pigs and one for poultry. There's a cattle feedlot one coming out. And for the first time in Victoria, we'll see an intensive dairy farm code. That's sort of to help those farmers who are moving into these intensive systems navigate planning. So they sort of have their own pathway. Grazing has their pathway through grazing, through the planning. Now intensive dairy farms have a pathway, so you work through the code. We're currently working on national guidelines from a dairy perspective. We know that feed pads and contained housing is just going to come through a lot more demand over the next few years, so we're currently drafting guidelines. This should be ready by early next year. So they've been written by subject matter experts in all the fields. So the Jake Martins has contributed, the James Greens have contributed from engineering. We've got animal specialists, nutritionists, agronomists, effluent engineers. So there's about 13 chapters written by Australia's and US best subject matter. They will be available early next year. So any dairy farm anywhere around Australia can step through the guidelines. Those guidelines will also have the state planning sort of stuff. So basically in Queensland, South Australia, if you're building this sort of infrastructure, this is your planning pathway. New South Wales have a broader intensive livestock guidelines, which covers all intensives. So it covers beef, it covers dairy, it covers sheep feedlots, so it covers everything. And we all know there's a national beef code, feedlot code out there. So anytime you're putting cows in the sheds or concentrating cattle, default to your industry codes because they're important, because they set out the objectives, the standards, and the approved measures you have to address, because that's what the local government agencies and the state government agencies are going to ask you. Are you meeting the objectives, the standards, and the approved measures in that environmental plan? Because if you are, we'll give you approval. We'll allow you to progress with the planning. If you don't address those, then they're just going to send it back. So before I hand over to Jade, just keep in mind that farmers often get caught. They do a lot of hard work with trying to figure out where the shed is and where to put it. Some of these environmental documents can be quite lengthy. We've seen documents that are over 700 pages of environmental planning to put up some fairly complex dairy intensive facilities. So they could be 300 or 400 pages. The environmental planners who do these reports for you, they can't do them in 5 days. They can't do them in 6 weeks. It will take them a few months to wade through the planning scheme, to wade through your farm. So Jade, keen to hear from your perspective. You had to go through this process about getting environmental planners, getting effluent engineers involved to sort of put those documents together for your local planning. So any insights?
Like many other farmers, I suppose, Scott, we're action men. We want it to happen yesterday. We can be prone to glossing over details. So I was out there trying to, and there's some good options, pick people, and these sort of people gravitate towards like high on detail, high on documents and actual data. You've got to really trust those people and put your faith in those people and support those people and give them the time they need to get the job done. So yeah, would be get the right people that are detail orientated, that have got runs on the board, and give them time. That's the ingredients for it. That it's not a quick job, like you said, Scott. But,
Yep. So for you, Jay, 6 months, 7 months to get through all this sort of paperwork?
yeah, at least minimum.
Yeah, a tough day in the office when a corporate rings you up and says, we want to put 20,000 cows into fully housed robotic free stalls, and can we do the planning in 6 weeks? That's the tough conversation, because it's generally no, it's can't happen.
Yeah.
So
I think what another comment I'd make, Scott, is it's actually a gift. That time is not wasted. 6 weeks or whatever it is, you need time to do other things. So it's actually a positive that it gives you time to do other stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So I've sort of emphasised the importance of your codes, because the codes for the sectors, they can be a sort of a generic code. So you see the bottom right, it's got environmental management guidelines for the dairy industry. So that's the whole New South Wales dairy industry. Other codes start to hone down into specific areas. So you look at the top left, management, this is dairy effluent management in Victoria. The Victorian one in the middle is Victorian feed pads and freestalls, and the beef sector has their own guidelines for construction and design. So this is chapter 16 is actually shade. So as I keep emphasising, if you're building anything, look at your sector guidelines, whether you're beef or dairy, because this sector guidelines is the sector's way of saying, look, we'll give you the best practices. This will save you wading through thousands of documents of the Environment Protection Act. You don't have to know all your state environment protection policies, the water, groundwater, air pollution. You don't need to understand all those. If you meet your industry best practices that's outlined in your guidelines, you're meeting environmental legislation. You're meeting the statutory planning processes. So the sector guidelines and codes are set up to sort of bridge what you're trying to do to navigate the environmental stuff. So as I said, they can be broad across the whole industry, or they can be more specific around certain areas, around effluent management, around shed design. So a term that we often say don't cross terms, and I'll say from a dairy perspective, the most dangerous term you could use in dairy applications is the word feedlot. This is nothing against beef cattle feedlotters, but if from a dairy perspective, if you mention I'm going to build a barn so I can feedlot my cows, that will confuse the local government. The local government person is looking at your application is going to see the word feedlot, and he's going to grab the cattle code, the beef cattle code, and he's going to ask, why aren't you addressing those objectives and those standards? So from a dairy perspective, never ever use the word feedlot. Use the word dairy dry lot. So it might be sort of a bit pointed, but it's one of those words. So from a beef feedlot perspective, so we basically, if you don't have a code that's or information that represents what you're doing, the local government's going to try to find something that matches. So we know there's a lot of beef feedlots that are starting to move into potential housing. So not just the shade shelters, but looking at the sort of the barn type of situation. There may not be a lot of barn information around for beef feedlotters. So you may be able to use some of the dairy information, because from a design, engineering, effluent management perspective, it's all universal across the livestock sectors. So use your own guidelines. If you haven't got that information, use what's next best. I've had one local government says there wasn't any information for dairy development, so they recommend he used the poultry code, because there's some nice stuff in the poultry code. Absolutely irrelevant. Stick to the cattle codes and the cattle guidelines. So from a farmer's perspective, we always know where to put the infrastructure. So this is a common where we go out and see farmers. Farmers know, yep, I've got to get it close to the commodity areas. I don't want to be driving up and down tracks and up and down roads to access my hay, my silage and all my feed rations. So I've got to put the facility close to that area. It's got to obviously access a main laneway. I've got to be close to the dairy and the handling yards. I've got to get in and out. Obviously, there's going to be power and water supplies there. If we can use a little bit of the natural slope, which is fantastic. And I've also at some stage got to connect this facility to the effluent system. So that's a farmer's perspective. They think internal. We will often say that when we get out there, you've got to think external. So think from a local government planner, because they're not asking you about your feed bunkers. They're not asking you about how close your dairy is. They're asking you planning questions. So they're thinking about that infrastructure being sited from their side of things. And is there risk to neighbours? Is there risk to communities? So they're thinking about how far from the township is it? Where are your nearest neighbours? Are you in a special water supply catchments? Where are the waterways? Those creeks, the rivers? What's the groundwater? Are there any property overlays? And we'll go through that in a bit more detail in a minute. But they're asking these questions about, is there going to be any impact? Are you going to knock down 100 trees to put that shed up? How close to the boundaries are you? Are there more trucks coming and going now because you're feeding more cattle? They're going to ask those sort of questions. So I'll give you a classic example. We went and saw a farm who wanted to put up a cattle shelter. It was a barn type structure for shelter only for summer. We asked the farm, where do you want to put it? And he said, I'm going to put it right here, close to the laneway, close to the dairy. We said, fantastic, that makes a lot of sense. Let's just drop the overlays over this site. When we did that, it showed that the barn had just clipped cultural heritage by about 5 metres. And we said to the farm, if you want to go here with this location, you will trigger cultural heritage, which will be a $20,000 to $25,000 report you have to generate to get through planning. How about we move that shed 5 metres to the west? In which we did. We moved the shed 5 metres, realigned it. We didn't impact the overlay, didn't have to address it through planning permits. So Jay, from perspective, I know farmers, it's very much, it's going to fit here.
Yeah.
But tell us about your story, but it wasn't just about fitting your infrastructure, was you had to deal with neighbours, you had to deal with land subject inundation, all that sort of stuff. So it's a bit more complex, and let's just stick it out the back.
Yeah, it was again, I'll keep harping on the same thing, but it just took time to, like you said, Scott, the farmer, his first option is where he wants to put it, and where it works from a management point of view, but there's just a lot of things to go through after that, and some of them you click through easy and you don't have any trouble. But we had a neighbour in a pretty close proximity, and we had to do some extra odor stuff for that. So yeah, we were, lots of things were fine, but we clicked on one. It just takes a little bit more effort on that one to get through.
Yeah, no, exactly. So most people will say, well, how do I find out these overlays? So you may not know, but you can get property reports. So every state has some sort of planning portal where you can go into. So these are a couple of examples. So Victoria's got a range of ones: MapShare, VicShare. Navigating Farm Development is one that AgVic's developed to make life a bit easier for all livestock producers in Victoria, because some of these government programs can be a bit tricky. So New South Wales has a good program called e-planning. There's spatial portals. South Australia has an atlas, a property planning atlas. Queensland's the same. So if you're building anything in any state, if you go into these government websites, so these are not Agriculture Victoria's or departments, these are state government, it will pretty much come up a menu. It will give you a map, and it's going to ask you to put your address in. And as you can see on the left, I've started putting my address in it. I've just put my 1333 Sinclair Road. I haven't even got to the end of it, and it's straight away picked up, oh, this is where you are. So it's identified that I live in Kai Valley, Victoria. So you click on that, that takes you straight to your piece of land. Then you can start working through on the right side. You can see your property reports. That's telling you the critical planning information. That's not only telling you your council property number and what government you're dealing with, it's telling you the size of your property, it's telling you all your title information, it's telling you all those overlays that are going to be on that plan. That's the stuff that sort of helps you with where I'm going to put this shed, how am I going to navigate planning. So this is sort of some of the information that you can get from these sites. So it will tell you where the floodways are, land subject inundation. As farmers, we sort of know this parts of our farm gets wet during winter, but once you pull these maps up, it will tell you the true extent of those overlays. So there's a lot of environmental stuff, environmental sensitivity, there's erosion, salinity. There's also some unique overlays, which are sort of region specific. So for example, in Gippsland, Victoria, there's a giant earthworm overlay. So that comes up in your planning, you're trying to put a shed up over a very long earthworm. They're going to ask you questions. Why is it going there? Have you done any investigations? Cultural heritage, obviously, is soil stuff, bushfire prone. So that sort of gives you a snapshot of your farm from the lens of a local government planner, because if you don't produce this in your report, they're going to pull it up and they're going to say, well, why haven't they mentioned there's a floodplain here? So access your information. You can do that. If you have trouble, talk to your consultants, talk to the deep Department of Primary Industries type agencies. They will help navigate. The other thing that comes into planning is that it's not only the overlays, it's what we call the distances. So there's 3 tiers of separation distances. Tier 1 is what we call fixed. All those codes and guidelines I've mentioned that you should look at, that will give you the fixed distance from waterway, from the neighbouring dwelling, from a small township, bore waters. So that will give you the fixed. That's generally for dairies and feed pads and small feedlot type of stuff. Once you sort of get into the intensive sort of stuff, putting cows in sheds or the larger beef feedlots, that's when you go to a tier 2. The separation distances at tier 1 won't be adequate. So that's where you start going to tier 2. You want to go to tier 2 because it gives you better outcomes, because it takes into account the number of cattle you have on that area, their stocking rate, their body weight, their manure output. It takes into consideration the type of facility you're actually building. How are you managing? How is it being designed? So if you're obviously managing effluent through flood wash systems and going through fairly elaborate engineered programs for the effluent management, that's a good thing. Your score will be a bit lower because the management's higher. It takes into account what receptors are close to you. Is it a neighbour? Is it a waterway? And it does the calculations for you. Takes into account site-specific information. Then that will give you a figure. It might say to build that freestall from the nearest neighbour is 411 metres. So it's a bit more robust in the information. If you go to council and says, oh, 100 metres from the waterway, they think, well, you're putting 1,000 cows in a freestall. We don't think 100 metres is good enough. They'll just knock it back. So use the appropriate approach. If you're putting a lot of cattle, so obviously if it's a large beef feedlot, a bit like the Charlton feedlots down here in Victoria, who's going through expansion, or whether you're putting 5,000 cows into a barn, which will trigger EPA's works approval, they might suggest that tier 1, tier 2 won't quite cut it. We want tier 3, which is odor dispersion modelling. We want a bit more industry-specific data to help with separating distances. The important part from feed pads, particularly in dairy, and this is probably our concern, we know that concrete flood wash slate feed pads are often the centrepiece within barns and freestalls. So conversations with farmers is, once farmers are doing this, we try to push them ahead and saying, well, is there intention to put this into a house system? Because siting a concrete feed pad is totally different to siting a feed pad inside a barn or a freestall. The separation distances will change, the planning will change. So don't assume you spend a lot of money on a feed pad and 10 years later it's a house system. You might get knocked back from council saying, well, you haven't got separation distances or you haven't met the planning stuff. So think long term. There's also, don't get hung up on that if you encroach on something. So 100 metres from the waterway, no one's going to come out and measure from the edge of the feed pad or the barn to the waterway. If you encroach, it's not necessarily a no from council. It's basically, all right, you're 5 or so metres a bit closer, justify it. What are the strategies you're putting in place to mitigate that risk? So don't sort of get caught up that it's set in concrete. You've just got to build a stronger case, a bigger argument to say, well, I'm not going to cause any impact. I've got all these measures in place. So similar to the Victorian. So as I said, building a concrete feed pad, Victoria, if you've not got no overlays or you've got those separation distances sorted, go and do it tomorrow. No one wants to know about it. But you will trigger a planning permit if you encroach on those buffers, or if you put it on an overlay, or if you're putting a roof up onto it. So that's the different stages. So grazing, feed pads, no roof, absolutely just go and do it sort of stuff. If you're not triggering any of those other things, categories. This is an example of a navigating farm development tool. So Victoria Spoil, this is starting to merge into New South Wales. So this is a program we built for farmers. So it allows you to go into your farm, you identify your property boundaries, which the council is going to ask you, where's your farm stop and finish? It asks you to select what you're building. Is it a dairy? Is it a house system? Is it a cattle shelter? It asks you then to draw it on your piece of land where you want to put it. Then it runs through the program. It tells you whether you're in farming zone. It tells you where the overlays are. And you can see from this slide, the land subject to inundation. That's telling me the site I've picked for this particular development looks pretty good. If I was to put that on one of those overlays, you know straight away I'm going to trigger something. They're going to ask me about, is there any impact to long-term flooding? The next part of the program helps you identify those separation distances. So you can actually draw from the barns to the waterways, to the roads, to your neighbour's place. And if you encroach on that, a message will come up and say, you're too close to your neighbour. That's going to come up during planning. So this is a good tool for farmers to actually use to site their infrastructure. And it can be any sort of infrastructure, not just barns and free stalls. It could be dairies, it could be calf sheds, it could be an underpass. It's infrastructure on farm. It allows you to sort of navigate your farm from a planning perspective. So that tool's available in Victoria. Some of it's merging into New South Wales, but other states have their planning things where you go through it. So the next point is that people say, when do we need to talk to neighbours? When do we need to have focused planning meetings? So we would generally say that once you get to a large stage or it's complex. So if you're going into housing system in dairy, we would suggest you need to have at least a focused planning meeting with government agencies, and you need to have a community meeting with neighbours, depending on how well you get along with your neighbours. So there's two types. So it's basically if you sort of can foresee that once I put this application in, I'm going to get an objector, there's going to be community concerns. You're better off having one of these meetings before you put the application in, because if you don't, it's going to come out the back end. So there's two types of meetings. The local community neighbours, that's where you invite them to a meeting. You outline your proposal, what you're trying to do. So you're very transparent. Then the other one's the local government planning agencies. Always do those separate. Don't have the two audiences together, because the planning agency is going to ask you questions like, so have you done odour modelling? Suddenly the neighbour's going to think, gee, we need to be concerned about odour now. So keep those meetings separately. It's a way of sort of showing that you are doing due diligence, you're transparent, you're taking consideration their concerns, their issues, and you're adjusting it through the planning. It also is an opportunity, particularly to find any surprises, because you don't want to sort of put your application, suddenly there's a surprise. So for example, we had the focus planning meeting for barn development, and the council says, you do know there's a school bus down the corner on that dirt road and there's 25 kids get on it. Have you considered dust? So when those extra trucks come in for grain and for milk collection, have you considered those 25 kids getting on that bus? So now we know that, we write that into our plan, that we've considered those 25 kids. So if you leave a hole in your plan, it will come back. So the bottom line is, don't fly under the radar. Don't just think, oh, we'll build this tonight, no one's going to know about it. Because I can tell you with Google Maps nowadays, people will know. There was a recent example of a piggery in Victoria who added another 12 sheds without getting approval. Council happened to be sort of looking at aerial photography in the area and suddenly saw 12 extra shiny sheds and looked at their planning system, says he's only got a planning permit for 5. Why are they extra sheds? So obviously he's got the visit from council. So don't hide this sort of stuff. So Jade, you went through both. You went through a focused planning meeting with government agencies and with the community at the Callawall Footy Hall.
Yep.
Great
Yep.
lunch.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that the secret, the lunch? Make sure it's good.
It's critical.
Make sure they're happy and full. No, but whether it's early on like that, or even when you're operating, and particularly at the start of your operation, is much better to be on the front foot and out giving the facts, giving the details, talking to neighbours is a much better approach than shying away from.
Yeah, excellent. So this is an example, Jade, of if you don't talk to your neighbours. This was a simple development that should have been simple in Victoria. This is well documented. Even people in America were aware of this. This was a 500 cow grazing farm. Their intention was to put up one freestall barn, increase to 500 cows, put up a small bottling boutique factory so they could sell flavoured milk to the locals. So fairly simple from a planning perspective, but when you don't be transparent and the shire doesn't know what's going on, your consultant doesn't do a good job, the investor doesn't do a good job, you suddenly get 460 objectors raising 608 issues. You can see from the bar graph, these are the concerns that are being raised. Effluent's always going to be high on the list. Effluent nutrients to waterways is always very topical. You look at, goes for the list, noise, odour, impact to the community image, it's going to impact tourists, impact to our roadways. Oh, cows and sheds, that's industrial, we don't like that. Animal welfare, even though animal welfare is necessary part of the planning process. From a farm perspective, it's critical because it can draw attention. So this is an example of if you try to cut corners and you think, oh, I'll just build this without getting a lot of approval, it can come back to bite. The result was this become so complicated, the farm left the industry. So we lost a dairy farm because this was just impossible to do. Once you get 460 objectives, you don't go back. So social media will kill you if you try to take a shortcut. So be transparent in the planning. And you can see the top one was lack of transparency. Your neighbour shouldn't find out the development going next door when they get a letter from the council. It should be, you'd be talking to them a lot earlier. I keep effluent separate because effluent is a massive part of the planning, particularly when you put cows in the sheds, because that changes your world significantly. We've been doing effluent design for over 20 years. And I can tell you that farmers often underestimate the effluent component when you start putting cows in sheds and on feed pads. It ripples. So this is a very simple example. Typical 300 cow dairy farm, a herringbone dairy. He's got 2 dual ponds, 5 months winter storage. So when you run the numbers for the design toolkit, it tells you that for those couple of hours that the cows are on the yard, the first pond's 1.5 megs, the second pond's a bit over 3 megs. That's your pond system. So a sedimentation pond and a storage pond. Some of the farmers said, I'm putting up a concrete feed pad. I'm just going to put cows an extra 4 hours. So only an extra 4 hours on top of the 2 at the dairy on a concrete facility. But you've added concrete, you've added more manure loading, there's more water to wash the feed pad, there's more rain coming into the system. So you look at the ripple effect to the pond. So those 4 hours is basically telling you now your first pond's half the size it should be, your second pond is half the size it should be. So you can imagine when you say, well, I'm going to put all those cows into a barn where they're going to live 24 hours a day. It's going to tell you that your effluent system is going to take an absolute belting. You need to look at the effluent. So from an effluent point of view, there is so many different types of systems. So a bit like sheds are not sheds, ponds are not ponds. There's sedimentation ponds, there's anaerobic slurry ponds, there's storage ponds, there's facultative ponds. There's so many combinations and there's so many components. Once you start getting to the pumps, the screens, the pipes, all the separation stuff, it will do your head in. So this is where you got to say, well, I need to talk to a professional designer, an engineer who specialises in effluent design. So for cattle feedlots, for dairy farms, talk to these people, because the manure streams coming out of these facilities is a lot more complex than manure coming out of the dairy. It's not necessarily just more loading, it's the material coming through it. So there's bedding material like sand, there's wood chips. So the effluent stream needs to be diced and sliced and managed accordingly from a house system as opposed to a grazing type system. Keep in mind that these systems have design frequencies. They're managed to be cleaned out. They have to have contingency plans built into it. The agencies, when you go through planning, are going to say, all right, what's your management program around your effluent ponds? If the wall breaks, what's your contingency plan? What are you doing? We would say that from an effluent point of view, it doesn't matter whether you're beef feedlotting or whether you're dairying, you need to document any activities that involves effluent. So if you're desludging ponds or if you're moving manure stockpiles or if you're applying it to land, just write down what you're doing, because that will create odour, and that's accepted odour emissions in the industry. You have to manage effluent ponds. So if there's short-term odour for 2 or 3 days, fair enough, the neighbours can deal with it. They won't deal with if odour goes for 3 or 4 months of the year. So if you document, we've desludged the pond, we've put effluent in the paddock, no one's going to touch it because it's best practice. The other important part of effluent management is don't underestimate nutrient budgets. So once you sort of create all these effluent into these pond systems, that has to go out to a certain part of your farm, a number of hectares. So we're starting to find some of these large developments of thousands of cows going in the shed. The conversation is you don't have enough land to apply these nutrients. The EPA is going to ask you, what are you doing about that? So Jade, your effluent system was quite complex, but you needed to take sand out of the effluent system. So you know, step us through your thinking on that.
Yep. So we got Jake Martin designed the whole sand barn, dropping the sand out system, and it works really well, and wasn't re-engineered. It was right from the start. But from the sand lane on, a local engineer did that. So that's with the solids and the nutrients, and he looked after that whole nutrient budget and that whole solids system. So Ours is a pretty simple system, just a solids dam and a green water dam. But the good example is our solids have got to go off to other farms, not our hub sort of dairy farm. And we've just desludged for the first time. And our contractors wanted to go 24 hours a day on the roads. And I said, oh, okay, that's fine. One of our neighbours after the second night was a bit unhappy with the noise. So, yeah, we had to sort of rectify our hours there. So, yeah, you just have to be really mindful of neighbours and different operations and how that impacts on them. It wasn't mentioned in any of our planning or anything, but things arise. You got to sort of, it's an ongoing impact on your neighbours sort of antenna you got to have up.
Yep, exactly. So bottom message is this is a specialised field of expertise, effluent manure system design. Yep. So the good news that industries have very strong databases. So the effluent one on the left is dairy, beef feedlots. So the difference between us is that we don't call it waste, because we've sort of changed that 20 years ago, because if you call effluent a waste, farmers treat it as a waste. They have that mentality of let's dispose of it, let's dump it, let's have a sacrifice paddock out the back. So the dairy industry has swung very much to that we will not call it a waste. The new environmental reforms in Victoria still call it a waste. That's the EPA's perspective. Our response is you call it what you like under your classification, but from a livestock sector, we don't recognise this as a waste product. Both these two databases have extensive knowledge on all the design engineering principles around effluent management. So these are sort of what we call the holy grail if you're doing effluent design. You'll find they're quite technical, which is why we say use a specialist, let them wade through all the formulas. So getting to the last few slides. So preparing an application. So this is sort of the general sort of layout of how you go through the procedure. So check the local planning scheme to start with. So this is where you sort of get your property reports, because that's telling you there's overlays. It might tell you got no overlays, which is a lot easier planning process. So once you get your property report, you'll start to understand what the agencies are thinking. Because as I said, if you don't download those reports, they will. And they're going to ask you, why haven't you addressed the cultural heritage overlay or land subject notation? Get your property titles, check those, because sometimes there may be restrictions or covenants on your titles that basically says you can't do that. You can't cut down these trees, put that shed up, because there's a covenant that protects these trees. Be aware of what's on your title. As I keep emphasising, go straight to your sector, whether they're beef, cattle or dairy. Go to your guidelines, your state, your national codes, whatever you can find that relates to your sector. That information will help guide you. Next bit about planning is they want to know where you're coming from. So what's existing? What's your current infrastructure? Where's your boundary? What's your topography? What are those sensitive issues in relation to your farm? Where are the houses? Where are the waterways? That's sort of a bit of an information about what we're currently doing. The next layer you put in there is what we're proposing to do. So a description, this is the size of the shed, this is the layout, the configurations, this is the scale of my development. There's going to be 3,000 cows in that shed. This is the locality of the infrastructure. So you're trying to match up what you're currently doing to what you're proposing to do. This is where you also submit those relevant reports that they may ask for. So any geotechnical information around pond designs, land capability necessity, any information on your farm that helps with your application, it's worth submitting it, because the agencies like the EPAs and the catchments may ask for it. So the next bit is you prepare that environmental impact statement, and that will change. So some are not called impact statements in different states, but this is the environmental report where you address neighbour, odour, visual amenity, dust. That's all those planning stuff that the community might ask. That's in your report. The last bit's a manure plan, which is sort of all the engineering design. As I said, don't want to see contingency measures in there. The last bit, once you've done all that, it's fine. Once you build it, you have to have an operational plan. So the system's up and running. How is it going to be managed going forward? So you don't just tick all the boxes, get the planning permit, build your shed. You've got to show that for the next 10 years, you're going to meet best practice, and there's not going to be. Also check the application, because when you download the application, it will basically give you a checklist. Have you submitted these documents? If you haven't submitted them, they're just going to send it back to you. So make sure you've got those right documents. The planning process may seem like it can be complicated, but it can be uncomplicated depending on what you're doing. So you obviously start by preparing those documents to support your application. Some states like New South Wales, there's a pre-application stage where you've got to seek development approval, consent to build that there. Once you get that tick off, then you start the planning process. So you submit the application to council. The council sends it out to what they call determining and recommending agencies. Determining ones are basically if they say, no, you're not building it, then the answer is no, you're not building it. The recommending ones, they're providing recommendations which you can take. So that will vary depending on the situation. So for example, if you're building it in a special water supply catchment, the water authority will become a determining because it's a special water supply catchment. So they send it out to the agencies for comment. So Agriculture Victoria, for example, we are not a statutory planning agency. We are not determining, we're not recommending. We are technical advisors to all the government agencies and to industries. So once it's sort of application goes in, obviously properties are notified, affected parties might, or general public, they get notice that there's a shed going up if it's big development. At some stage, the council may request further information, and that's sort of, that will slow you down. That's why we'll say, and Jake have emphasised, and spend the time up front to get the planning information right. Because if you put it into planning and there's a hole in it, someone's going to find that hole and they're going to send it back to you and say, we want more information. Every time they send it back, the clock resets and you start again. If there's issues and concerns, it will go to mediation or could be resolved through council. So at some stage, council will make a decision, or they'll get a delegated planner in council to make that decision. So it could be approved with conditions. They'll basically say, yep, happy for you to build that shed. These are a few conditions we want you to consider. You could say, no worries, I'm going to build that shed with those conditions. You could say those conditions are unreasonable. Therefore, I'm going to appeal some of those conditions, which is your right. The opposition, so the objectors can also appeal those conditions if they don't think the council's given you enough conditions. So there's an appeals process. If all that falls over, then it goes to some sort of arbitrary tribunal, Victorian, VCAT, New South Wales, Queensland, they all have their tribunal. So it goes to a higher authority that they can sort it out. So everything goes well, we would say that putting up a barn should be a 60-day process. But if you don't prepare your application and you get objectors and things don't go well, you can expect 12 months of planning. Some could go on for years, depending how complicated it is. The other key aspect is start your other planning. So it's about getting planning approval, but you know that you're building a shed, you're going to have to get building and works. You might have to get a license because there's 5,000 cows going in those sheds. Start some of those other planning processes while you're doing the planning application. So you don't get to the planning application, get the green light and say, all right, now I'll get an application for the buildings and works. Then I'll get an application. Do it all in conjunction because it will speed up the process. My last slide, Mike, if you please know, so some key tips to planning. So we see many farms building a lot of stuff, and we sort of see the good and the bad news stories. We would tell you to know long-term vision. Absolutely critical is that don't retrospectively build. Don't build a feed pad and say, oh yeah, in 3 years I might put a roof on it. 5 years later, it's going to be a full house freestall. Look ahead because it's the siting and location is quite important. So we will tell you, particularly with the barns and the freestalls, any of the housing type systems, you need to have a long-term vision for the farm because it will just come back to bite you if you don't. Don't underestimate the planning. As I said, don't just think I've done all the hard work figuring out the type of shed where I'm going to put it. I'm going to put an application to the council and try to get this back out. You've got to take the time, particularly with the house system sort of stuff. Do due diligence because if you don't do due diligence, someone's going to figure that out. You haven't done enough. Use the specialists. So you'll use special service environmental planners, engineers, shed builders, government environmental people. Just use those people with the specialist knowledge to help compile that report. That will add more weight. The general rule is don't try to bluff agencies because the bullshit will catch you out. Particularly early on, people found out that if we build a feed pad, it's low level planning. Although say, so I've used the grazing term. So early on, we had these grazing freestalls. If a grazing freestall comes to in planning in Victoria, we would knock it back because why would you build a freestall which is capable of housing those cattle? And why would you put cows out in the paddock? The two systems will fight each other. You're compromising production. You're building a very expensive shed, as Jake would tell you, to put good quality cows in it. You're going to put them out in the paddock. That just does not make sense. So use the correct terminology. Don't try to bluff agencies, because if agencies don't know, they will hand it to specialists. Specialists will say it's smoke and mirrors. They're trying to deceive you. And keep informed neighbours. Let them know what's going on, because they'll get wind of something going on and suddenly it's a lot bigger than what they think it is. It's just a barn for cows. Oh, that's okay. You're in a farming zone. You should be able to do that. So my bottom line, I've had conversations with farmers that says, oh, we might just not get a permit for this and see if they catch us. My advice is being consistent over years is it's like going to the casino. Roll the dice and take on the casino. The casino will always win. Nowadays, with the technologies, the aerial maps and the social media and people just looking in your backyard, they're going to find out. So don't be paranoid about planning. There's a few things to get through. Talk to the right people. It shouldn't be a hard task. So my last example, Mike, I had a farmer in Queensland who said, I'm in trouble with the Water Authority. I'm sitting in my Echuca office. I said, what's your address, mate? I zoomed into his backyard. I said, your pond's overflown. It is tracked 70 metres from that pond. So the big green snake I can see from Echuca is telling me that in 30 metres, you're going to hit the Richmond River. That's why the authorities are after you. He says, you're in Echuca. It's amazing how you can see my farm. So Google Earth and aerial photography, you can't do anything nowadays because everyone's got a satellite above you. So Jade, your keys to success?
For approval, it's just, you got to trust the process. You got to trust the specialist. You got to put good people around you to get through and use the time wisely for other planning needs. It's not an evil process. It's sort of half a bit of a gift, because you've got to you can use that time for your own planning. So yeah.
And Jade, one of those things, how did you know when you're sifting through this and you've never done this process before,
yeah.
How did you know when it was right? What gave you the sense? Was it just the people you were working with, or was it a light bulb in your head to saying this actually computes?
From the authorities' point of view, or from my own planning? Huh?
From your own.
Oh yeah. Well. I think it's probably when the people around you start asking questions and you've got answers for all of them. That's probably a bit of a moment when you've got it. When you've got a visitor or something and you can take them around and show them, this is my plan and this is what I'm going to do, and this lays out the next 10 years if we want to do expansion. This is what it looks like. Yeah, when you can sort of get your vision across to other people, and when people aren't asking questions you don't have answers for, that's when you've probably got it.
Terrific, that's great. And a question just come in there, just I guess on the budgeting side, when you're looking at a barn, costs seem to pour in on top of you, and putting an infrastructure, and people say, what?
Yeah.
So just having a budget in mind for this planning side. As in, open question.
I'll give you a couple. So often farmers get caught out because they price the barn and they price the sort of the infrastructure. Well, I've got to get more cows, so that's sort of their pricing bit like from a farmer's perspective. Suddenly they figured, well, the effluent pond's a bit small, so I've got to do a bit more extensive earthworks. I hadn't really thought it's going to grow by 40 megs. That's a lot more earthworks than I thought. Therefore, that's an added cost. I've got to get an environmental report, which is it's complicated planning. So they're going to spend a few weeks sorting this out. So I've got to spend money for these reports, and they could be tens of thousands of dollars, depending on the complexity of development. Or something they're saying, we want odor modeling because you've got so many neighbours. So you've got to get an odor report. That adds value. So you sort of got to look ahead and sort of say, from a planning perspective, what are the critical areas I've got to cost into it? Because costs will blow out. And they don't necessarily have to, but particularly in planning, that some of those things, we hadn't planned for that. We weren't sure that was relevant. So include that with your discussion about, I'm building a barn, I'm going to put cattle into it. Start looking ahead about what's the planning entails.
Anything to add there, Jade?
I'd say from a farmer's point of view is either factor in factor in some room in your budget, or what I did was I factored in another little. It was a heifer dry lot that I want to do one day off the side. It wasn't critical to the operation of the barn, and if things went well, I could have got it done. But it's as time goes by and little things creep here and there, you can go, no, I can't get that done. I can put that back into the barn, and you sort of don't miss a beat. But if the worst thing would be have to go back to the bank or cut some corners that are critical to the operations, they would be nice to avoid those ones, I think.
Well, you said to us yesterday, day before, was just that planning side. When you look at the amount of steel and concrete and everything and all the machinery that's involved,
yeah,
that planning is a very small small number.
Yeah, a really robust plan, documented out and takes in more years than you're actually building for is a really valuable document, especially to your first one. You've never done it before. I don't know how many times our in-depth plan saved some communication problems, took the pressure off the farmer. I couldn't. It's money well spent.
And Scott, you talked about your the worst day on the job, when someone comes to you and says, I've got 20,000 cows and I want a planning application through in 6 weeks. What's your best? What's the guys when they approach you? What does it look like?
Yeah, so the message is, from a farmer's perspective, don't fear planning. Don't lose sleep over it. Don't think, I've got to deal with a lot of government agencies and bureaucracy, because it's not always like that. If it's complicated and it's large developments like the 20,000 cows, his rush was he needed to obviously pay the investors back quicker, so they needed to get operational very quick. The location was just going to be problematic from the start, particularly 20,000 cows. So the message is that, talk to your local council, because they'll say, geez, it's just a roof, it's just a building permit. We can do that pretty straightforward. They're not sending that out to the agencies for referrals because it's just a roof. So planning relates to what you're trying to do, where you're trying to do it. But typically 28 days, council have got their stuff in and out in sort of 3 months. You could be building these sheds. We've got a farm who's putting freestall up, 1,000 cows in a freestall just over the border, 6 months. Started planning, in and out, cancel, and bang, it's 1,000 cows in the freestall. So as Jade said, if you get it all right, do it once, do it right. Talk to the right people, get the right reports, get the information, because once you put the application, they can't knock it back. You've answered all their questions and all the other questions they haven't answered. It's sort of, well, we've done due diligence. We've considered absolutely everything. So it shows. There's lots of guides on how to write applications. A lot of the planners going to say this is information you should put into it. So we sort of do find now that, particularly with the bigger dairy and beef developments, the application's going a lot better. They're not the paragraph, I want to build a shed and put a cow in it sort of stuff. They're not that sort of stuff that can get knocked back. There's a lot more thought going into it. They've talked to the specialists, the engineers, the planners, and the report's a lot more robust.
And Jade, just one for you. You talked a lot about planning. I guess the stages. There's a few questions coming in just in regards to the stages of, I guess, when you're lying in bed and you say, I think I want to put cows in a barn. From our meeting this week with cows in a barn and you up and running.
If I go back to the start of it, Mike, for me, it's probably very personal for each person. It was a long dreaming episode. It was probably 2 or 3 droughts. There was land purchases. It was a lot of things building up to it, but I always sort of had it in mind. It wasn't until the last few years that it was, right, I'm really serious about this. It just was a staged process, and I think that gets the best results. Is that you get the right people around you over time. You don't just ring up in a week and get this really good team of people around you. You've got to get to know them and which way do certain people work, and yeah, it just takes time.
Terrific. Terrific. Well, thanks everyone for holding on and joining us today. I know we had a few technical difficulties there at the start, but you're all there. I think just to close off, I think I see it in my job when we have those times when light bulb moments hit, you know, when we take people on, and it's generally when we take them on farm and show them some great design, some great planning. And they've got this, I think our industry and the media and our consumers have got this perception that barns are bad. But, you know, all the barns that we went into this week were fantastic facilities, and cow comfort's through the roof, and cows are doing awfully well in them. They're great places to work. So, yeah, going out and seeing these facilities, I think is a number one attribute. Jade, and you did a fair bit of touring around before you sort of finalised on your.
Yeah. For a farmer who's like likes to see it and smell it and feel it and know what it sort of is like. I had a couple of Australian trips and a couple of over a long time, a couple of American trips. And yeah, you sort of get the likes and the don't likes and the yeah, does it like gut feel? Never avoid your gut feel, Mike. Gut feel of would I be proud of that as a complex is always a really good one. I always had my wife's got a cousin who is goes down the she probably would vote Green. And we sort of had her on our shoulder. What would she be thinking of this facility? You know, and you come to a fork in the road and you've got to make a decision one way or the other. It doesn't drive the whole thing, but it's just be aware of those people's thinking. Became a good result. So,
well, terrific. It's been very informative. We've got a lot of positive comments there through text and on the question and answer. So thank you, Scott McDonald, for joining us this morning. We really appreciate your time. Thank you, Jade, for jumping in and sharing your experiences. I guess this is a start of a conversation for all those that are online and would like to hear some other industry experts talk about it. We've got great feedback from our last webinar and great feedback from this one and great attendance as well. So please shoot us through, reach out to us, let us know what are the current issues and questions we need answered as an industry, and we're more than happy to put a couple of great professionals in a room that can present the information in a really practical way. So thank you, Scott, and thank you, Jade.
Pleasure.
Have a good day, everyone.